you're gambling with World War III.
Это нарушает нашу безопасность, расширение НАТО.
As a military strategic planner, a former planner, you don't want politicians telegraphing what your next moves are going to be.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too.
A peacekeeping force does not exist with a ceasefire.
The morning of August 1st, 2025, began like any other in Washington, but by evening, the world found itself staring down the barrel of a nuclear standoff that would have felt perfectly at home in the darkest days of the Cold War. President Donald Trump, in what can only be described as an extraordinary escalation, announced that he had ordered 2 U.S. nuclear submarines to be repositioned to appropriate regions in response to what he called highly provocative statements from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. The moment marked a chilling return to the brinkmanship of decades past, but with the added volatility of social media warfare and real-time nuclear threats. The chain of events that led to this underwater chess match began earlier in the week, when the White House issued an ultimatum that would make even seasoned diplomats nervous. Russia, Trump declared, had 10 days to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine or face crushing new sanctions. It was the kind of hardball diplomacy that leaves little room for face-saving, the diplomatic equivalent of backing someone into a corner with nowhere to go. The Russians predictably didn't take kindly to being given ultimatums by Washington. Enter Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president who has transformed himself into something of a digital provocateur since the Ukraine war began. Once considered the more moderate face of Russian leadership, Medvedev has spent the past 3 years firing off increasingly inflammatory posts on social media, most of which have been ignored by the international community. But this time, his words found their mark. Medvedev accused Trump of playing the ultimatum game and reminded the world that Russia possessed nuclear strike capabilities. Each new ultimatum, he warned, was a threat and a step towards war, not between Russia and Ukraine, but with his own country. For most world leaders, such provocations might have warranted a stern diplomatic response or perhaps a strategic leak to the press about military readiness. But Trump, never one to back down from public confrontation, chose a different path entirely. In a post on his Truth Social platform that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, the president announced his submarine deployment, adding ominously, "I hope this will not be one of those instances where words lead to unintended consequences." The deployment itself represents one of America's most potent military assets being moved into position. The United States operates more than a dozen submarines capable of carrying nuclear warheads, forming the sea-based leg of what military strategists call the nuclear triad: air, land, and sea deterrent systems. These underwater leviathans are the most undetectable part of America's strategic nuclear force, capable of remaining hidden beneath the waves for months while carrying enough firepower to level entire nations. They are, in essence, the ultimate trump card in any nuclear standoff. But what makes this deployment particularly unsettling is the ambiguity surrounding it. Trump deliberately left unclear whether these were nuclear-armed submarines or simply nuclear-powered vessels. He also refused to specify exactly where they were being positioned, leaving the world to wonder whether American nuclear weapons were now lurking off Russia's coast, or positioned elsewhere in the vast expanse of the world's oceans. This calculated vagueness is both the art and the danger of nuclear diplomacy. Enough uncertainty to keep your opponent guessing, but also enough to spark genuine fear about miscalculation. The reaction in Moscow was telling in its initial silence. For hours after Trump's announcement, there was radio silence from the Kremlin, the Foreign Ministry, and the Defense Ministry. It was as if the entire Russian leadership apparatus was trying to process what had just happened. The only immediate reaction came from Russia's stock market, which plummeted as investors absorbed the implications of a potential nuclear confrontation. Even the typically bombastic Medvedev seemed stunned into silence by the response his social media provocations had generated. What's particularly striking about this confrontation is how it emerged from the digital realm. For 3 years, Medvedev has been posting increasingly outrageous statements online, most of which have been dismissed as the rantings of a has-been politician trying to stay relevant. Russian media observers noted that most of his posts went unnoticed, making him seem like a social media troll with nuclear weapons rather than a serious diplomatic voice. But suddenly, one of his posts had captured the attention of the most powerful person on Earth, transforming a Twitter spat into a potential nuclear crisis. The timing couldn't be more precarious. Trump's 10-day ultimatum to Russia is set to expire at the end of next week, creating a ticking clock scenario that adds urgency to an already volatile situation. The threatened sanctions aren't just aimed at Russia itself, but also at its trading partners, including economic giants like India and China. The potential for this standoff to spiral into a broader economic and military confrontation grows with each passing day. Meanwhile, as nuclear submarines glide silently through dark waters and stock markets tumble, Trump's special envoy Steve Bannon is reportedly preparing to travel to Russia, possibly to meet with Vladimir Putin himself. One Russian news site colorfully described Bannon as a rabbit being pulled out of a magician's hat, with Trump as the magician. But even the most skilled diplomatic magician would be hard-pressed to diffuse the tensions that have been unleashed by this extraordinary week. The current Russian president, Vladimir Putin, has remained notably restrained in his public comments, declaring that disappointments only came from excessive expectations. It's a measured response that stands in stark contrast to both Trump's submarine deployment and Medvedev's nuclear saber rattling, perhaps suggesting that even Putin recognizes the dangerous territory into which this confrontation has wandered. What makes this moment particularly chilling is how it demonstrates the ease with which nuclear powers can slide toward confrontation in the digital age. A provocative social media post leads to submarine deployments. A diplomatic ultimatum sparks threats of nuclear war. The guardrails that once prevented such escalations seem increasingly fragile in an era where presidents communicate via social media, and former officials use Twitter as a platform for nuclear threats. As the world watches and waits, the submarines continue their silent journey to wherever Trump has ordered them positioned. The Moscow stock market remains jittery. Diplomatic channels buzz with urgent communications, and the 10-day clock continues its relentless countdown. In the end, this standoff may resolve itself through backroom diplomacy or face-saving compromises, as so many Cold War confrontations ultimately did. But the ease with which we arrived at this moment, and the speed with which nuclear weapons entered the conversation, serves as a sobering reminder that in our interconnected, instant communication world, the path from social media provocation to nuclear brinkmanship has never been shorter.